What am I? What are we, anyways? What am I? What are we, anyways? Differentiating and sometimes debilitating emotional experiences. Early life is both imperfect and stressful, and complexly formative for individuals of every species, including Homo sapiens. Profound biological impediments to full intellectual functioning, such as fetal alcohol syndrome, autism, and various mental handicaps, are easily seen as in their limiting capacities. We humans, in our diverse cultures, also seem prone to manufacture addictions to many poisons, create crime ghettos, allow crushing poverty ghettos, beat each other up for somewhat specious reasons, all of which stymies full development, limiting potential, somewhat or seriously or very profoundly. Also prevalent are implanted patterns of emotional reactivity that live through us for significant parts of our lives. Some of these disturbances can be helpful. Many are just idiosyncratic. However, many are both limiting and personally destructive for the individuals involved. And whole societies can be hobbled and contorted by implanted patterns of destructive cultural emotional reactivities. All animals' life experience is profoundly determined by and limited by, constricted by physical environment and many random local influences. Contingent is an appropriate word. For humans, each social eco-niche likewise produces somewhat unique patterns of behavior and feeling. Life in Papua New Guinea, or in Shanghai, or New Orleans, or rural Madagascar fills large groups of people's minds with powerful and idiosyncratic reaction patterns. Different regions of the globe have quite distinct and idiosyncratic cultures that co-create individuals with long-term proclivities of every kind. The way each person sees, verbally, conceptually processes, and feels the world and responds to the world is manufactured by their local environments over 10, 20, or more years. We defined a knot, K-N-O-T, as an emotional reflex conditioning tied to embedded in words and memories and or self-concepts. These have been patterned by local environments. Often emotional complexes are implanted when we're children, and they power emotional reactivities that also trigger by association. We seldom use words neutrally. We have opinions and deeply held beliefs. Many opinions or beliefs are tied to strong feelings. Opinions and beliefs are often based on a few half-remembered ideas and parts of ideas we picked up when we were young. Knots can play out subtly or megaphone loud for the rest of our lives. The feelings hold the ideas, and vague, half-formed ideas trigger the intense feelings. Some knots feelings flatter and inflate and help us feel valued and valuable. Some feelings feel nasty and need to be eschewed from our minds. We seldom recognize that feelings often enough arise preconsciously and are the causes of what we think, not always the result of what we think. Since we hear thoughts in our heads, the ideas thoughts often result from emotions that are playing out in us. Anger and jealousy and even hate can swamp the individual who Legos together reasons and rationalizations for the feelings. Individuals in groups contagion each other with furious emotional firestorms. Groups of chimps do the same. We actually remember very little detail about early experiences and past encounters and old stories. We often hold on to a gist, a complex of a few remembrances, often bound together by a defining feeling or maybe two. Many of our intense likes and our worst dislikes create themselves and stick with us for much of our lives. Knots are like exemplars or faintly remembered but obstinately held orientations to imagined experiences or to somewhat jumbled memory events or orientations to key stories or ideas. Often, knots are a series of fixed ideas, feelings that we live by, swear by, believe in, and defend socially. Most of us don't remember where our chief orientations or deeply held principles come from. They are us, and we live them, or they live us. But not unusually, the emotion that sticks becomes predominant and habitual, becomes what we feel about a person, place, or thing. The emotion is what actually defines and keeps the knot resonating in the present. The positive characterizations that go with pleasant knots become what and who we like. Certain friends at school, a bunch of key ideas and slogans, pithy defining aphorisms, types of people, an experience at a camp, a teacher or two, kinds of music. Many aphorisms and pithy sayings are just coherent bundles of images, ideas, locked in feelings that satisfy, glorify, sanctify clan and local prejudices. I often feel that pop songs, whether country oldies or wrenching rap rants, or those delightful musical ditties, carry recent knots that please and puff up. We've realized that thoughts come to us according to their own laws. They appear in our minds as heard inner speech. We don't cause them, we can't control them. They happen in us. And the same is true for feelings. We often have a series of key stories or remembrances or half-felt and vaguely understood reactivities. Actually, this is most of thought, most of standard thinking, and much of what dialogue conveys. Certain off-played truisms, aphorisms that we believe implicitly are our chief beliefs about how the world works, about what is absolutely true and right. Negative characterizations, especially if they are unusually intense, become who we don't like, or even what or who we hate. Certainly, an old humiliation, sharply hurt feelings, a contrary political or religious idea that is uncomfortable. Small childhood betrayals of any kind can stay with us for a long time, sometimes forever. Before leading up to World War II, hundreds of millions of people had completely overt and very intense ideas, assured beliefs about the supremacy of one race over others. the malingering and evil habits of the lower classes, the inferiority of women, the obvious laziness of the Irish or some other race, East Indians, blacks, Asians, etc., the depravity of gays, the deservedness of poverty, etc., etc. Passionate beliefs memes that they proclaimed aloud and held deep in my heart. Do you, dear reader, think we don't? Every generation of every era has held to its prejudices with assurance and exceptionalistic certitude. Culture, mommy daddy, and knots, and short stories, deeply held truisms, a story about an exemplar or a minority group, emotional assumptions about class, gender, etc. And the emotions they bind keep other possibilities, counter ideas, at bay. We seldom recognize how feeling marshals ideas or trains of thought, and often disallows contrary or potentially threatening ideas from ever surfacing. Some of us wallow in serial negativities all our lives. Many of us feed our judgmentalism and self-inflating exceptionalisms. It feels so good to be superior, more insightful, the rare bearer of truth. And we seldom seek out contrary ideas that may discombobulate our cherished bromides. And today, our media parrot self-aggrandizing memes and stories and perpetrate soothing bromides to us, willing participants and recipients. And much of religious and political orientations are equally fierce and nebulous. It's interesting to feel what a belief is. Often enough, it feels like the experience of an idea concept with intense feelings attached. Often enough, super intense feelings attached. Check out internet discussions these days. If I can squeeze my face up tighter than you can and assert how overwhelmingly powerful my belief is, then what I'm believing in must be true, must be truer than you. How much human carnage has come from this kind of rigid certitude? And we often let ourselves believe that the more intense the feeling, the more true or valid the idea is. Remember the saints of old, strapping and scarring and starving their miserable bodies. Religious OCD, political OCD, and often enough sexual OCD in the service of fixed ideas. And boy, did it make one feel good, humbly in the service of God good. Belief unto death is still ubiquitous. How else could we have soldiers, suicide bombers, martyrs? Each creed, and not just religious creeds, injects overwhelming feeling into its practice to inculcate belief into us. Because we feel so much love for our God, we believe beyond doubt that He, she, it exists. Actually, what don't we believe in? Isn't all life intense beliefs? Political, spiritual, scientific, psychological beliefs, and self-beliefs. Don't get me started. And love. Don't get me started. And my feeling of absolutely sure belief, believes itself superior to your absolutely positively beyond doubt belief. And I might have to kill you or somebody to let you know how much I believe what I believe. Not, K-N-O-T, is a symbol, a usable metaphor to point out engendered or conditioned patterns or complexes of concept, feelings, and behaviors that are generated in childhood or adolescence and lived ever after. I think of the hundreds of millions of men who have blithely gone off to war to be slaughtered for some series of 5 thoughts or feelings around patriotism and manly pride. I think of the millions of women through history, ruined and tortured, psychologically and some physically, and self-tortured over vague, ill-formed idea feelings about purity and virginity. Key, rabidly held religious inanities that adherents were more than willing to die for and kill for. Knots. Arun Fiwum, living in Bangkok, was just a little guy when his mom invited an American teacher, Phyllis Wilson, to their house. He reacted pretty intensely to the perfume the woman was wearing, and she was sweating a lot too in the sweltering monsoon. And the whole night was a bit of a bust for the family. Arun pitched a full-out tantrum. His dad was humiliated. Everyone was upset with him. Ever since, he has a somewhat vague, it was a long time ago, disgust and a bit of an attitude whenever he's around Western women. Yet he's also a bit intimidated. Scott always gets a bit pissed off thinking of Democrats. His dad just about had conniptions when Jimmy Carter was president, and he remembers him ranting endlessly about damn Bible thumpers taking over the government. But he loved his dad. Being a Republican in Louisiana hasn't always been easy, but he joined the CNRC in university and has never looked back. Louise vaguely remembers the Christmas she got that Kathy Cuteness doll. She thought she was going to get a much larger one and was bitterly disappointed. That night, she even poked out the doll's eyes and had to hide it for months after, or she would have gotten it, especially from her stepdad. She hated that Christmas. That was 30 years ago, but she can still blush with shame thinking about it. We'll never tell anyone about that, what happened that day. The highly intense reactivity of many of us about so much of life is in significant ways resulting from knots, from embedded emotion attached to fragments and figments of thought that drive us. Differentiation between individuals relies mostly on likes and dislikes, goods and bads. And many memories revolve around pleasant or unpleasant. People who have experienced rough, violent, and confusing upbringings often have near overwhelming knots and intense judgments of many types that drive them for much of their lives. We identify with people and ideas and even things that have very strong positive valence for us. We dislike and even abhor many, many things reflexively. Partial, somewhat skeletal memories of people and various occurrences with strong feelings attached sustain many of our prejudices and whole worlds of core judgmentalisms. There isn't much in life that can't precipitate fairly ferocious feelings in some of us. If we imagine the crazy and exuberant diversity of cultures, subcultures, and in particular the near infinitude of individual cultural eco-niches and the formation of knots of every kind of feeling valence that become our true reactive personal core, it makes sense of our diversity and also of our unending divisions and our fierce quarrelsomeness. What we're coming to is, in many respects, the core of our everyday humanity. In significant ways, thoughts, feelings happen to the individual all day long in every situation, from waking to going to sleep. Feelings drive us and drive most of our culture. And socially, thought-feeling interactions are shared, extended, just like words extend inner speech, and determine the milieu. Much inner speech is associative, and likewise, many knots mostly happen to us in our minds reactively, and the social milieu, over which we have little control, takes over the rest. I've often described the word world, but in truth, for lived experience, it is the word feeling world in which we live, and which is the basis of almost all personal interaction, story, and modern communication. Word feeling complexes are created in the child and become active. Social life is the constant sharing of these quanta of experience. They, words and feelings, are both forms of perception and means of survival. The thought-feelings domain happen to us and determine us. It feels like we determine what takes place between ourselves and our neighbor, but truly, the complex interplay of trans-individual interactions, the social milieu, is trans-self-created through varying periods of time, long and short. What comes to my mind and how I react are not mine. Think of a society that girds itself for war. A miasma of overwhelming feelings propagates through the citizenry. Formally, relatively passive people find themselves in a fury about people occurrences that a few months ago they scarcely took notice of. Many volunteer themselves or their children for the coming slaughter. We are exposed to a limited number of concepts, ideas, and cultural memes as we grow up, and the environment, intense family, class, regional, political, religious, personal affiliations, attaches strong valences, attaches fierce emotional qualia to ideas and orientations that often become the foundation of whole complexes of interrelated values. Once certain values or orientations are absorbed by the individual, opposing feelings or contrary values are not likely to be explored with a lot of enthusiasm. Catholic precepts, Sunni Muslim precepts, conservative or liberal precepts, upper-class codes of conduct, or street-smart perceptions, etc., are formed sturdy and are pretty resistant to challenge or change. To abandon clan values is more than uncomfortable. It is downright dangerous. In the past, it often meant death. And once I strongly believe in something, it's very likely to stick for the rest of my life. I probably will not even read, listen, explore other options that may cost me a great deal if they seduce me away from the clan value. I don't want to listen to that. I don't feel that way, which is part of the reason we all stay within our class, within our peer group, among our friends. We think we're open-minded, but our feelings make it unlikely that other experiences will resonate. But now I'd like to treat in detail one fairly common modern experience of families in the West that have profound effects on our citizens, on our adults and children. I'd like to point out this is exemplary. This is meant to give flesh to these fairly abstract ideas. There are many other kinds of experience quite as determining, but I am presenting this as an example. Each culture and many subcultures have fairly unique mini catastrophes that affect individuals powerfully. I'm using this one to show in story fashion the processes that implant long-term word feeling patterns into us. Most obviously, there are many such processes all over the world. A Muslim child brought up strictly in rural Iraq, an untouchable caste garbage picker in village India, an Orthodox Jew in New York City, etc., are uniquely created, and the co-created brain emotion networks profoundly individualistic. Each individual thinks, feels, reacts idiosyncratically, but consistently. There are no unbiased observers in the struggle of life. Our simple and much oversimplified media-dependent views of reality make it hard for us to fathom why we can't get along, why we misinterpret each other so consistently. Children of radically different cultures are created idiosyncratically. Knots, those powerfully implanted feelings idea complexes, become the filters through which reality is twisted. Okay, an exemplary example. Divorce, family dissolution, and feelings of stress and rejection in the West. Modern culture and politically correct compassion reflexes make it uncomfortable to talk about the trauma and deep-seated residuals from family breakup trauma. This storm that most often touches down during the pre- or beginning school age. The majority of divorces and separations take place when children are 3 to 7 or 8 years old. This is the family trauma, tragedy, farce of the separation and divorce of parents. Admittedly, things are complicated because many other experiences influence us during this differentially discombobulating experience. How many and what kind or age of siblings are around? Amount of contact each parent eventually gets with each child. Whether both parents are temporarily destabilized or only one. Chronic, nasty verbal fights, violence, etc. These are determining. But the early and painful disruption of basic acceptance and rejection patterning is critical to some of the most long-standing and generalized reaction patterns of many adults. How difficult for the child to fathom the mini catastrophe of the nuclear family, whether formally married or not, having no mental emotional framework to fit the experience into, reacting raw to complex feelings and overwhelming dramas that are seldom explained meaningfully. For many kids, there are various stages, degrees of feeling, and major themes of this social, personal tragicomedy that have myriad different manifestations. But certainly there are a couple of writ large, predictable components. The first and most immediate part is the breakdown of the man-woman dyad, mother versus father, with its frighteningly rapid dissolution and aggravated moods, and often enough, flare-ups, arguments, and wild mood fests. Loss of emotional balances, depression, and overindulgence in substances, legal and otherwise. The sudden collapse of already eroded self-esteem. And not unusually, the triggering of past, well-hidden calamities from childhood in the parents, such as hyperreaction to a sense of abandonment, driving insecurity, and self-rejection. Throw in some kind of violence in maybe 50% of cases, psychological violence in maybe the majority of cases of dysfunctional separation, and instances of physical violence of various sorts in at least 15% of families. But just as nasty, the war of words against the opposing parent that schizoids the child and sets up an intense inner conflict. And soon enough, the partial loss of the attention and attendance of one or both of the parents. Sometimes the child effectively loses both parents, as when the mom gives herself away to a new male right away, forgetting the kids at home for variable periods of time. The child trudges through much of this tangentially and vicariously and helplessly. Attached most strongly to mom, children roll through to differing degrees depending on age, maturity, and many other factors. They roll through her depressive rages and crying jags, her need to invalidate the worth and meaning of the partner who now feels like a worst enemy, her panic and obsessive worries. Depending on how engaged dad has been, the child lives through the relatively abrupt disappearance of that other parent. Frequently a source of fun and esteem according to different rules and rhythms and rhymes than mommy, and who now also suffers from cyclic rages, frequently admitting confusing bad words directed at her, and sometimes perpetuating unbelievably bad behavior that can be like nothing the child has seen or felt before. Many parents do not too bad at this stage, though many do horribly. But the next stage is tricky too. The second part begins when the separated adults need to soothe, heal, and reconstitute themselves. On average, around 75% of folk are rehitched within 5 years. Mom and dad both go to work to find replacement partners. This is a pretty vulnerable stage for the young, and often enough the adolescent child. One big slough of despond for many children, besides the continuing bickering and worse of the parents themselves, is that the parent, particularly the mom, dad does it too, but less contact makes it not so potent. Mom becomes anxious and way overstressed and desperate. Desperate for messages of acceptance, needy for some modicum of good touch, needing to be relieved of the overwhelming responsibility and the weight of chores and economic burden. And horny. Don't forget the biology. Pushed by these needs, she may latch onto some guy who doesn't fit very well with her, but more ominous for the child, may not fit well with her offspring. This takes so many forms as to be a book itself, but some of the commonest fails follow. She hooks up with the man who competes with the child or the children for her scarce resources of attention, affection, and central place in the household. He plays out his own childish unmet needs by serially rejecting the woman, then accepting her back, ever competing for who gets top billing in the small theater of the life of the family. If he doesn't win, gain dominance, he takes it out on her, overtly or covertly, by word, mood, and censure, and certainly on the children by being rejecting or so over strict and nitpicky critical that he proves them unworthy of mom's attention, thereby easily gaining central billing as the saving disciplinarian, or by not helping her hardly at all with their upkeep, thereby exhausting her and making her need him more. Boy children often settle into suppressed fury, depressed alienation, and hair-trigger aggression, often directed at mom, who feels like the culprit, the cause of dad's going away, and the appearance of this rigid, joyless replacement dad. And girl children often get hyper-needy, obsessively pleasing, withdrawn and depressed, or the various other panoplies of nasty reactivities. Thusly are intense knots tied. There's another man in our common rogues gallery of basically only sign up for mom men. He seems unable to muster up hardly any affection or engagement with the children. This guy always seemed to me to be playing out the animal kingdom's rule of the male rejecting, or worse, other males' progeny. Our modern males don't annihilate these offspring physically, but sometimes psychologically seem to pick one or the other of her children and systematically reject them, making them badder and badder by his ruthless criticism and perfectionistic chore making that they can never satisfy. He's being prone to irritable, long-distance controlling, getting at them through her, that drives the whole system mad until she flees him or joins him in the rejection. Sometimes he changes dramatically when she produces his child, though often his habits of rejection and authoritarianism remain well entrenched towards her brood. The depth of isolated abandonment that some kids go through in this scenario is quite pathetic and leaves deep and lasting knots or scars, emotional scars of all sorts. Another type of man fights the biological father in absentia and demands the children come on board with his unspoken agenda. This is tricky for the kids trying desperately to hold on to some shred of allegiance and contact with the absent parent. This guy finds many, many reasons to hate and denigrate her ex. She's often more than willing, especially at first, to provide the needed ammunition and drive him as far away as he can. Grossly, this results in fistfights outside the kid's house, ultimatums to her, them, and the ex, no contact orders, myriad court orders, and lawsuits galore. And the kid's bad behavior is further proof of the original bad seed and evil intention and improper upbringing by the supposed perpetrator. Women are frequently equal perps, though often much less toxic because the womanly need to nurture competes with confused feelings of this specific kind of Oedipal-like tragedy in many acts. From their side, women frequently enough are equal perps from their side as new wife and replacement for the old bitch witch, evil stepfather meet evil stepmother. There are near infinite gradations of it, some only irritating and uncomfortable, others ferocious and debilitating. The crazy-making part of it is the impossibility to own the behavior, or even more, the intention or driven needs playing themselves out. In such families, everyone may live years of torture, and no one, him, her, them, knows quite why or how the misbehavior manifests. Everyone scapegoating everyone until the final explosions and confused shakings out. One other very common constellation, star-crossed, of experiences for children of this age that results in long-lived trauma is when the custodial parent is desperate and driven to find someone new to make me whole. Just divorced or separated, the parent is dating hard, making choices at times driven by such need that it blinds. Letting relative strangers, sweet-talking strangers, bar-hopping strangers, manipulative and clearly fucked up strangers, others see it so clearly, into the home and into the bed. The more battered the self-esteem, the less defense she or he has. In truth, the worst seems to happen to women largely because men are so sexually predatory. This tragedy includes flinging relatively young children onto babysitters who shouldn't be babysitters, leaving kids alone for long periods subject to abuse of many kinds, making children conform to men who have stupid, rigid, fixed ideas about many things that otherwise would be rejected as laughable, subjecting self and families to periods of subservience, economic and emotional, and relationship warfare that saps will and any joy. Attempts to seduce blithely single men to play false roles for the privilege of boffing the woman of the house. There's no humor here when you see it, and at its worst, it's terribly tedious and grievous for him, her, and the kids. The parent is the chief protector of the child, and when the parent forgets or neglects or can't or won't, myriad mini tragedies strike the kids and the parents. And friends and police spend much time blaming someone, frequently enough blamable, if that is true, and feeling helplessly sorry for the trapped kids. But the parent must protect. One last type is the well-intentioned man whose view of reality makes it incumbent on the children to treat him with somewhat obsequious respect and love almost from the first moment they, the newly enamored couple, decide they're gaga over each other and going to commit to each other. And when the child, boys are so overt in this, especially early teen boys, but girls do a corresponding dance. When the child is not ready or amenable or in too much conflict because of unfinished business with absent dad, the man feels terribly rejected and begins systematically to try and pressure the child to love him. Of course, getting nothing but the opposite. And then overtly or covertly rejecting the ungrateful child and begins needing to find all the things that are wrong with the lacking appreciation offspring to feel good about himself. The more the stepdad has felt rejection and failure, under the onus of his own lousy childhood, the more ferocious his need to be loved. And mom needs him to be held in such esteem that she often quite willingly joins him on his bandwagon and helps drive the spiral of resentments. There is much more that could be said about these situations that are so usual as to be prosaic. The prosaic pain that children and women and men are engulfed in when relationships falter. These stories are exemplary. I'm using them as archetype. There are countless other archetypes that could be explored, knots of many degrees of intensity. Such separation and divorce dynamics are many tragedies of Western cultures, but there are myriad upon myriad other examples that could be cited. Each culture, probably each geographical area and unique blend of families in each area, have patterns of pain and strife that leave knots, scars, long-held pain that is seldom well articulated or even attended to. But some patterns are pan-cultural, often present across populations, and they form adults with quite intense feelings. One example from yesterday, might be the trapped and stultifying lives of women in traditional cultures when there is simply no exit from poorly arranged and ultimately abusive marriages. The almost universal sexual exploitation of children of vulnerable classes and castes is another. The historical abuse of children in industries, ranging from the myriad forms of sweatshops to mines and industrial slavery of so many varieties. The almost universal abhorrence and mistreatment of gays in most cultures until very recently. The examples proliferate. And the idea-feeling complexes manifest mostly unconsciously because they are formed non-cognitively in the vulnerable child. Many of the painful core ideas and emotive patterns of the adult come from experiences analogous to the description of children of divorce and remarriage described above. Rigid religious upbringing, induction into fanatical and sometimes violent ideals, experiences of grinding poverty, overt radical exclusion from the core cultural acceptance, etc., result in thinking, feeling, and behaving in ways that other groups simply can't fathom. War and violence and societal instability of so many types are also formative. None of this denies that divorce can be done civilly and reasonably peacefully. I just wanted to highlight some bad behavior because I believe that these experiences slam the growing child at his or her most vulnerable and leave the somewhat fragile self trapped in intense whirlpools of cognitive emotional reactivities that reverberate for years at a time. And pained early experiences critically affect pair bonding and adult relationships and parenting at much later dates. And this fits well with all the previous themes about how experiences of rejection are interjected by the child into its self-nexuses, and how we react to and try and suppress feelings and experiences that are laid on us as we grow up. Diverse cultures inflict diverse traumas on vulnerable citizens. Citizens in China under Mao Zedong during his Great Leap Forward were warped and ruined in ways we can scarcely imagine these days. Napoleon Shanghai describes life among the Yanomami sympathetically, but myriad organic harms are the everyday experience of the majority of women and children. Islamic subcultures, some modern Hindustani subcultures, some Papua New Guinea subcultures, Mexican crime subcultures, woman trafficking subcultures, aspects of American subcultures, etc., and etc., and etc. Violent, bizarre, mutilating rites of passage for adolescent boys or girls are typical of many cultures. What I'm pointing out is that children and adults, men and women, embedded in almost every culture, acquire conditioned trauma, memory, pain that follow them for much of their lived existence. And since feelings drive us, societal trauma reverberates through time and populations. This is not a rational or controllable process. Like thinking and behavior in general, it is spurred by experience that just happen and play out over time unconsciously. History is a nightmare from which I'm trying to wake. Returning to the main theme of how emotional complexes are integrated to the word self. There is a hierarchy of response to emotionally painful complexes. The worst damage, of course, depending on severity, is done to children when they're 2, 3 to 6 or so, and it can be irreversible. At best, modifiable and subject to certain attenuation, and at times results in strange adults who live by strange response patterns. Textbook examples might be classic borderline personality disorder, some intractable lifelong depressives, subpopulations of chronic wife batterers, some people without consciences, some hyperviolent types, and a few more psychological calamities. These states of emotional hyperreactivity and near disability result from consistent early unbearable abuse, which forms a sense of self that is at its core wounded. This doesn't mean that their lives are worthless or unlivable, but that patterns of overreaction are probably not fully reversible and must be worked around rather than completely healed. Our idealization and romanticizing of ourselves and our children, of their everyday experiences and the trajectories of their lives, allow us to live in la la land. We of the West imbibe too many TV images and watch many, many TV lives. We kind of project fictional average citizenry as exemplars of who we are. And our exceptionalistic thinking often assumes that that's the way it should be, too. And the bad guys are one-dimensioned and get it in the end anyway. And they are, of course, other people's children. It's excruciating to let our peer group know that our child is damaged or mentally ill or criminal, etc. Many inner cities are messes. Many neighborhoods and barrios in large cities in the world are hellholes. Many of us live and die lives of quiet desperation. Hunger still stalks millions upon millions. War zones abound and spread voiceless despair. The last years of debilitated life for many of our old folks are tragic. And then there's anxiety. Anxiety is one of the primary controlling impulses of our species, as is true for all higher mammals. There is a natural level of personal anxiety, which is actually a very complex phenomena, which we'll mercilessly oversimplify. Personal anxiety that stays with us all our lives, and which is an overall controller of many things. We often forget that some individuals are quite susceptible to intense anxieties for most of their lives. We hide this one well. And each one of us is individually subject to anxiety related to people, newness of experience, everyday threats, humiliations, self-esteem, etc. I bring this up in relation to all the experiences that I've been describing, the kinds of trauma that scar and condition the self and form its patternings. An organism, an individual, a kid, can already be somewhat or very prone to hypervigilance, extra vulnerable to stress, already susceptible to psychosomatic reactions. Anxiety can be very easily induced in those already highly primed for anxiety. Anxiety, like simple fear reactions of every kind, is often a potent long-term stressor, leading to the release of corticosteroids and other stress hormones that affect the body-brain in many obvious and plenty of subtle ways. Human anxiety is a fascinating emotion in many, many ways. For animals, anxiety is generated when some external cue triggers the animal about threat, or some cue in the environment triggers either an innate reflex of fight or flight, or re-triggers a learned anxiety from past experience. Anxiety is protective, but costly in many ways. A deer's hyperalertness protects it. A mother's hyperalertness protects her child. But the stress of generalized life competition is also extremely anxiety-producing. Most animals don't make it to maturity, after all. And even mating and its rituals hold animals in long-term states of approach avoidance, agony, anxiety, ecstasy, and corticosteroid oversupply. And both predator and prey have cycles of intense anxiety. I've already noted that social life itself, life among crowds, finding a place in all these hierarchies, looking for a mate, are super stressful for all of us naked apes. Periodic horrible or horrifying conditions of early childhood both overstimulate and entrench in overdrive high levels of everyday anxiety. Exploring divorce in previous pages, we found children of many ages trapped in double binds, approach avoidance, and high anxiety situations for years at a time. These states may well modify the substrate, the complex pathways that mediate emotional responsiveness, may modify permanently. And this influence of innate and created anxiety affects all kinds of stages and transitions, especially entrance into school and all its glorious stressors, and more especially coping with family upheavals, the transition through adolescence to adulthood, transitions of place, moving, state, marriage, divorce, adoption, and being, hormones, menstruation, pregnancy, menopause, old age, etc. Words and memories replace experiences, and complexes of words and memories recreate in reverberatory and analogous ways experiences that have touched us. Extreme shyness, extreme social awkwardness, perseverative habits of many kinds, physical and emotional tics, Emotional modulation difficulties of various kinds, excessive anger, recurrent anxiety states, periodic emotional meltdowns, etc. Depressions, panic attacks, eating difficulties of many varieties are some of the more obvious and public sufferings that many individuals have to wade through at various points in their growing up. The mind is very adept at many self-protective tricks that keep it from feeling bad. The well-known techniques include minimizing, blocking out unwanted stimuli, many hallucinations, unrecognized lying, denial, and selective recognition of all sorts. But these are also confusing. We forget, or most likely just don't see, the lostness of many preteens and teens and young adults. They hide their suffering and despair so well. And we project adult coherence of thinking and feeling onto our young when they are often mired in overwhelming turmoil. Among animals, once a clear environmental stress or trigger is absent, the animal or group relaxes and can, in a reasonable time, forget about the threat. Among us humans, words and images as analogs can carry large cargoes of anxiety for extended periods of time. If a while ago I was attacked by a pit bull, just thinking about such an animal can fill me with overwhelming dread. And I could think about it all day and all night for the next few months. And 10 years from now, the memory of the attack may be almost equally traumatic. In some individuals, the memory can be even worse than the actual attack. And since words are abstract, that is, they are not dependent solely on the environment, they can and must produce anxiety when the threat is no longer present. Strong anxiety unmoored from causative stimuli, free-floating anxieties. And we can even attach quite profound anxieties to hypothetical and or theoretical entities. Hell and damnation, rogue asteroids, killer bees, zombie attacks. And obviously, because we can think of things over and over, anxiety states can stay with us an awfully long time. One quite novel and somewhat newly created aspect of modern life is how whole societies can share self-created and self-inflicted cues to anxiety. Whole societies can be carrying clearly named or subtly hinted at fears, both specific and nebulous. After the 9/11 attacks in New York, thousands, if not millions of individuals pictured, thought about, ruminated on real and imagined terroristic scenarios. The lugubrious parades of daily news tragedies of so many varieties, the constant reminders from political parties and pundits of all stripes how foobar it all is. I would translate that word. Screen images of starved and diseased strangers needing rescuing and money, and all of the shared and somewhat inflated worries of the population exploded blogospheres. Video footage of war zones, victims of aggression, whole peoples under siege. Why or how we've chosen to proliferate our anxieties so wildly and profligately is probably a book in itself. We've all seen a deer, maybe with a fawn, on the edge of a forest, raise her head. We watch the large ears flick and twist this way and that to pick up the slightest sound, and the head twitches, Anxious alertness is crucial to salvation for the individual animal. It's the result of millions of years of evolution. Much human mental anxiety is like constantly scanning the environment, the screen, story, neighborhood, word sphere for possible threats. And we become masters at it. We worry about anything and everything. And because we have so many worry words lined up row by row, serial worrying is epidemic. And because we're so social, we can worry about all the things that could possibly go wrong among us. And we're so worried about safety, we teach our children to be very worried. We constantly remind and remonstrate, and our schools are almost never amiss in teaching our children what to watch for. Our extraordinary everyday safety and security is partially a function of our seemingly hyperactive worry industrial complex's success. Conditioning's rule. We began talking about some complex, pretty heavy-duty feelings coming from things like divorce and early trauma. Recently, we've mentioned anxiety, some natural anxiety, but also some more modern implanted anxieties. Children need and learn to need approval and approbation and so many kinds of acceptance. Teens need and learn to need approval and acceptance and approbation desperately. We all need and learn to need approval and acceptance and the sweet glow of success desperately. And we all need and learn to need approval of the opposite sex desperately, and even more than desperately, driven by hormones. Children, and we are all children, become baskets of anxieties and basket cases of anxiety. To please, to be liked, to be good, to make it. The long game hormonal brain complexes are, of course, seriously in charge of the whole shebang, and they're also being shaped and modified by culture and early experiences along the way. Sexuality, sociability, competition for resources and mates, dominance. How much of modern life, or simian life for that matter, in all of its complexity, is really about these drives and needs. When they, us children, cross even very subtle lines of behavior, we even help them feel guilty for thoughts that go through their heads. They fear rejection, ridicule, being ostracized. Outside the group, pack, herd, clan, peer group, church, there is no salvation. And the group voice is implanted in our heads, though we're unconscious of the planting, hearing only the voice itself. Living in such relatively large groups, classrooms, and under such intense security, the watchful eyes of parents, teachers, peer groups, police, cameras, etc., children are sensitized to and hypersensitized to group norms and group disapprobation. And the rules and regulations and the punishments are all deeply introjected. We are enslaved and enslave ourselves to the slightest quiver of anxiety for much of our lives. If this sounds too horrible, it isn't. Compared to raw life for average members of Homo Sapiens sapiens in past historical times and climes, our culture has learned to control us, but also to keep us safe. Compared to losing children in droves, tightly conditioning them to avoid danger may be what we choose. Compared to anarchy and gang life and chaos and rapine, Our firmly introjected group social self-control messages, Steven Pinker's Leviathan, may be what we choose. But we didn't really choose, did we? Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, or much-deserved Hobbit-like peace and quiet and 8 meals a day. What's interesting here is that only in recent centuries have we mechanized scientifically and furthermore monetized ways to keep ourselves in line. And equally amazingly, we don't even recognize it. The coward dies 1,000 deaths, the brave man only once. The anxious feel 1,000 threats. Conditioned anxiety magnifies the slightest hint of danger or pain or loss of face. And our, historically for the West, relatively gentle and peaceful social echo niche doesn't give us much practice in toughening up. In some ways, modern upbringing and modern society eviscerates us, keeps us small and quiet, immures us in our own proper cells all our lives. In India, millions upon millions have been kept enslaved in their deigned castes for millennia. Many of us have been kept bound by our class and our station. Although there certainly are fierce external constraints, patterns of conditioned thought, patterns of fear and conditioned feeling are more than sufficient to keep us in line. Many of us are so hyper-reactive to any anxiety in our hearts, never mind something real taking place in the environment, that we stay within the lines without the slightest peep or protest. As a matter of fact, we seek unconsciously for rationalizations, virtuousness, for our pusillanimousness. I never shit disturb. It's wrong. I try and be good, don't you? Truly, societal imposed straitjackets, and all unconscious. We've met our jailers, and they are us. People and institutions perpetuate these things only half-conscious as to what they're doing to the children and even to themselves, doing to ourselves. We believe in our assumptions. We believe in our nots implicitly and passionately. And we believe because we don't know or clearly recognize what we're up to. We're created, but not consciously and not by ourselves. We fight commercials because we don't like the conditioning messages, not seeing that teachers, pastors, mamas, pundits, sports figures, celebrities, etc. are up to the same tricks, influencing, getting them to need what we think they should need. How many influences are there today? In truth, the processes of embedding conditioned reactions in malleable young'uns feels right and righteous, implanting faith, implanting patriotism, implanting exceptionalisms of so many varieties. And we give ourselves permission, partially because we're so sure we know why we are here, what our purpose is. Our myths of self-creation doesn't let us see that story, not continuous cognitive emotional conditioning by culture fills our minds, constrains and channels our thinking. We've created a hermetically sealed story world. a hermetically sealed world story. And we have analyzed the world so confusedly that almost anything goes. We have no real need to look at why we're doing it in this particular way. And now the media fulfills almost all our desires, seduces us with action, terror, sex, and exquisite titillations. And the chorus subtly murmurs our glories, our evolvedness. Word feelings follow word feelings following word feelings. What's so interesting about what never happened? What's so interesting about word feelings going through my head? All the people on the TV talk shows, the nice man up there in the pulpit, those sweet and attractive CNN and Fox News anchor women telling me the truth. Mommy's lecture, grandma's words of wisdom, and all the books, including the Bible, the Quran, the I Ching, Lao Tzu's words of wisdom, and all the movies and TED Talks, bombarded with pablum, platitudes, and thousands of sermons. So much of it is Western culture's often twice well digested homilies. We pundits sure like to tell us what the right and wrong and the good and bad of it is. Frequently, parents and teachers and yogis, feminists and priests and pastors, philosophers, counselors of every ilk, reporters, are absolutely assured they're simply improving, self-helping their charges, and have no inkling that they're attaching negative anxieties to prejudged experiences and embedding positive needs to a specific issue or experience. How expert have Western political parties become in packaging stories and lies they want us to believe. Think of isolated, born-again communities or communes, and so many cult-like clubs with their God-ordained truth and rock-solid belief in their own righteousness. Think of Islamic schools, terrorist schools, the burning with God early settlers, witch burners, in America. Trotsky, Lenin, Marx, all so sure they knew what was right for us stupid people. The Spanish and Islamic and American slavers, absolutely sure they were right and righteous. Stalinism, Maoism, Kimism in North Korea, the committed prophet and fanboys of capitalism in all its fury and destructiveness. The last thought metaphor for just now is that what we're also doing through all these early years is grinding a key, the child's personality, so that it will eventually fit snugly into the lock of society's structure. And the key purports to open all the promised treasures of the society to the desirous child. For 100 years, the military has been carefully studying and scientifically mechanizing and standardizing and coordinating how to forge obedient killers and destroyers of faceless enemies, and succeeding nicely. Less sadly, when society begins to look askance at your behavior, for example, smoking, and attach negative valences to thought, feelings, or activities, the anti-smoking crusade, those horrible cigarette packages that you have to look at. And when groups start to punish those who partake of certain habits, smoking, drugs, overeating, too much untrammeled sex, bullying, etc., and when specific traits are touted as just and righteous by power-possessing segments of the society, exercising, donating to your political party, going to church, you see the myriad ways that the group is trying to implant controlling behavior mods on segments of the larger society. And although we all want to believe that we're rebels at heart, the cost of non-conforming is exorbitant, more than most are willing to pay.